All right, so first of all, welcome everyone to this workshop that is called Staring into the Eyes of Shame and Bringing Healing to the Inner Child. It's the third one in the series of 4 workshops. We did the 2 first last week, and it's not, you can easily take just one of the workshops. You don't have to do the other ones to understand what we do today, all right? Just to say to most of you who haven't been here, maybe for the other 2. I'm Charlotte Skogsberg. I'm from Sweden originally. I've been here for about 5 years now in Bali. And I'm a yoga teacher here at Samadhi, but I also have a background in clinical psychology and psychoanalysis, which is one of the reasons that I find it so interesting to combine kind of the Eastern and the Western view on things, and why we also call this yoga psychology. Because basically what we'll do today, and I'm going to start with explaining on a more general way. Those of you who were here last week for the other 2 workshops have heard this, but it might just serve as well to hear it again. And then also because most of you actually weren't here on that one. So when I say yoga psychology, for me in a certain way, it's 2 things actually. In the yogic philosophy, there's already a notion of yoga psychology, which is just yoga, actually. Because if you would look into what is called the Yoga Sutras, which is the holy book, if you will, in a certain way of modern yoga, that explains a little bit the functioning of yoga. In itself, that is explaining how the mind functions and how yoga, or actually meditation in itself, and then the physical part has been a very loved part of yoga as well, is a way to calm down the fluctuations of the mind and therefore find the stilling of the mind, which is really kind of the goal of yoga in itself. And just that in itself is what in yoga we would call yoga psychology. But when I then talk about yoga psychology, I also take in the more Western view of the human psyche. And that's also because I think that the kind of issues that we encounter today, and especially people coming from the Western world, wasn't really taken under consideration, I think, in the yogic philosophy, because it wasn't really the kind of issues that would be encountered. I think one of the reasons that we are the way we are today is also because we are very far away from what would be our perfectly natural habitat. Not only geographically, but of course that as well. Did you know that colors have an impact on the ways of our mind? So, of course, naturally, the color green and the color blue have very calming effects on our minds and on our whole systems. The nervous system actually reacts to those colors, and that seems very natural when you think about if you would live out in nature. It would be 2 of the colors that you would find almost no matter where in the world you live. Blue and green will definitely be quite present. But when we live in grey, which is basically what cities are like, we're very far away from that. And that in itself has a strong effect on us. I'm sure that most of you just have had that experience of living in the city somewhere, and then you go out in nature. And just going out in nature and looking around you, you're kind of a little bit calmer all of a sudden just by doing that. One of the strengths of the mind is that we have the capacity to visualize, right? To imagine. That is actually one of the advantage of being human, to have developed what we call the prefrontal cortex. It's our capacity to project ourselves, to plan ahead, which is a blessing in disguise in many ways. But one of the blessings is that we have the capacity to visualize, to imagine in our mind's eye something. And the thing is, when we imagine it in our mind's eye, our body responds as if it was actually in front of us. And that is a real advantage to us if we know that that is the case and if we know what to do with it. It doesn't serve us most of the time, because actually most of the time we're living in a past and future. And the past and future has taught us to always be planning ahead, worrying about the future, or going over and over again about past things that happened that we would have done differently. But what happens is we're actually visualizing when we're doing this, right? And so the body is responding as if it's happening. So that means that things that have happened to us that can be either traumatic, like quite strongly traumatic, or just traumatic in the sense that it's a resistance, it's something that we didn't enjoy. The more we relive this, the more the body responds that this is happening constantly. This is how it's hard to heal certain things as well. All right? Anyway, that was not at all where I was going to focus on, but that was just as an introduction to things. So, in order to speak about yoga psychology, let's start from the yogic perspective. So, yoga explains our functioning very much by the subtle body or the pranic body. Prana meaning energy, if you will, or life force. And when I say energy or life force, I mean something as simple as the fact that you can feel that you are alive. And you can feel that your energy is high, for instance, and strong when you have a good routine, when you sleep well, when you eat the right things that your body can easily digest, when you have a routine of some kind of physical activity that helps you to sweat and to burn and to detox and also just to become stronger, right? And then your mind is clear, your heart is open because you feel strong and you're coming from a safe place as you're doing it, and you feel it yourself. Your energy is high, you're vibrating. And on the contrary to that, you can also feel when your energy is low. Your energy is low when, for whatever reason, you're out of whack. When maybe you haven't slept well in a while. Maybe you've been traveling. Maybe because of that as well, you haven't really been eating the right things. So you've been feeling tired and you've been trying to compensate by eating fat and sugar, for instance, to give you a quick rush for the brain. But unfortunately, it doesn't work so well for the digestive system, so that you're not burning it as well and you slow down your metabolism. And it's kind of just like a whole kind of vicious circle that brings you into a feeling state of not feeling great, and you can even say it that your energy is low. All right, so when I'm talking about prana or life force, I'm talking about just as simple as that, and we can all feel it, right? And so the yogic philosophy has a very detailed way of explaining how this functions. And the physical part of yoga, in a certain way, is all about this. It's all about clearing the energy channels so that the energy flows freely and basically bringing ourselves back to health, or keeping health, really. So they explain this by several things. The pranic system is built up on chakras and nadis. Now the nadis are the energy channels. And the energy channels are, well, they count 72,000 of them in the body. And it's what we would, in a more modern view on things in biology, talk about nerve endings. We have, in biology, we would talk about the central nervous system coming from the brain, and then the main channel would be basically the vagus nerve that comes from the brain, follows the spine, and all the way down towards the tailbone, and then we have the periphery, which is the nerve endings that goes out, all the nerves that goes out in the body, all right? And so in yogic philosophy, it's the pranic body that has these nerve endings as well, called nadis, and the main ones are Sushumna, which is basically then, it doesn't matter for the names. It's going to be strange names sometimes that are Sanskrit names, you don't have to remember them, but also strange names that comes from our more medical point of view as well, you don't have to remember them either, all right? I'm just saying that now. The main channel, which is then following the spine, which is why actually the spine is the main thing in our yogic practice. Whatever kind of yogic movements you do, it is all really about having a flexible and strong spine, right? It's also, of course, because the spine then connects the skull, the torso, and the pelvis, of course, and therefore even linked down even to your heels. So when you move, all of that kind of comes from that main part. Like, it's really a mechanism, our whole body, in a certain way. Now, it's also then, I mentioned the word chakras. So, chakra means vortex or whirlpool. It's basically represented by, let's say, a circle. Of course, we're talking about energy here, so you cannot actually see them. If you would open the body, you wouldn't find these vortexes in the body. Which is why, of course, with our very Western view on things, we have a tendency to say that we can't really believe that it's true because we can't really see it, right? Anyway, that is another discussion. Um, Now, they would explain the chakras differently depending on the school. I will talk about what is, I guess, the most known, usually talked about, and the one that is very much linked to how the physical is seen in a more Western or modern view. The 7 main chakras that are situated along the spine. Starting all the way down, basically where you have the pelvic muscle, a little bit further down even, down by the tailbone if you will. It's not actually on the spine, it's a little bit in front of the spine. And that's where we have the root, which is called Muladhara. Alright, so Muladhara chakra, it's our root chakra. It's the first one that develops, and that's what we worked on last week on Tuesday. The second one is just a little bit above it. They say, I think, 3 inches or something. But it doesn't really matter that one either, okay, how high up it is. It's in the pelvic bowl, quite deep down, just a little bit higher up. It's called Svadhisthana. It's our sacral chakra, and which is linked to very much then everything to do with the pelvic bowl, all right? It's, I'll go into that afterwards. The third one, which we'll work on today, we come up a little bit higher up, and it's called the navel chakra because it's just above the belly button of the navel, but it's underneath the rib cage. So it's really where we have our solar plexus, right? So it's also very much represented by fire, of course, because this is where we have our digestive system. So it's the combustion of the body. We burn the food here in order to transform it into energy. It's called Manipura, and it's our sun, our powerhouse, if you will. So therefore also situated where we have the solar plexus. Now, one thing, I'm going to just stop and say this as I continue explaining the other ones, but one thing I find very interesting is that this is where we have our center, right? This is really where we build the structure of ourselves. Yet, we don't really have any bones here. So we're holding ourselves up here by sheer willpower in a certain way, if you will. So, of course, when we talk about this chakra, it's also very much about strength, muscle strength, because, well, what am I pointing here to? It's the center part of our core. So everyone loves core work, of course, right? The 4th chakra is situated in the heart center called Anahata. Anahata not meaning heart, like a lot of people think it does. It actually means unstruck. We'll talk about that tomorrow. 5th chakra is the throat chakra, situated just here. 6th one is the third eye center, the most famous that everyone knows, situated here, in between the eyebrows, basically. And then we have the 7th one, the crown chakra, Sahasrara. And what's interesting is that in biology, we've come to connect the chakra system to actually, well, all the systems of the body really, but the endocrine system, which is the hormonal system. So that means our glands. Because more or less exactly where we place these different chakras is actually where we have glands in the body. And the glands, just like the chakras, are well functioning if they allow for the hormones to be secreted properly. And anyone who've ever heard about thyroid issues, for instance, knows that a malfunctioning thyroid gland is blocked, basically. Either, well, it can be excessive, or it can be hyper or hypo, as they say. Too strong or not enough, right? So it's interesting that the gland, the way they describe that the chakra is functioning properly when it allows for the energy to flow freely, send it out like that, it's actually how the glands work as well, if they can secrete the hormones properly. And the hormones, as you may or may not know, has a very big impact on our health. If it was working properly, all the rest of the systems in the body will also work properly, and it will affect us emotionally, it will affect us mentally and physically, just like how they describe on a well-functioning chakra. All right, so this is why it's really interesting as well to look into how it's really just coming down to one same truth, but using different terminologies or different ways of describing things, basically depending on when in time the theory has been funded, right? It's the same today. We go through these paradigms There's moments in time where one truth is commonly known as the truth. And then there's a new scientific approach or whatever that changes a little bit things and might just really explain things that comes down to one same truth, but differently. So I would like to see it that way. It's all just back in those days, thousands of years ago, that was a way to approach this, which is exactly the way we approach it today, but just with a different viewpoint and different instruments, obviously being able to look into the body in a different way. And one of the things that I said, I think, on the very first day was the vagus nerve is the longest nerve that we have. And it's a very thick nerve as well, and it follows then the spine. It has a tremendous impact on our health. Some of the really nasty diseases that exist, chronic diseases even, comes from a malfunctioning vagus nerve and can be completely actually healed through stimulation of the vagus nerve. And the stimulation of the vagus nerve that is done in medicine is actually electrical stimulation. And what is prana if not basically our electricity, right? It's energy. So also with our yogic asanas, for instance, or even meditations of sitting still, we are stimulating the vagus nerve. But you can also imagine that thousands of years ago, some kind of shamanic person or doctor-like, if they would open up the body, a dead body, and they would find the vagus nerve, you can understand why they would call this a snake, for instance, which is really what the whole Kundalini idea is behind. It's a snake, as they say, that goes up from the bottom to the brain. So can you see why I'm saying it's kind of the same way of just explaining the same thing, but in different ways? So coming into more specifics, talking about the third chakra today. Very quickly, just so that you understand where I'm coming from, why I'm choosing to talk about the third chakra today. The first chakra is our root, and it develops the first year basically in the life of the child. And as we are born, we're born completely inefficient, not very productive. So we're completely dependent on our caretakers for survival. Usually this means parents, but some kind of family-ish kind of looking group that will make sure that we are fed, that we are taken care of, that we are clothed, etc. So we're very dependent on that, which means that it's during this first year of our life that we also start to develop a relationship to safety and security. And so depending on what we've seen in this first year, we will have a look on the world that can be very different from one person to the next. We will either see the world as a very safe place, or we might actually see the world as something quite threatening, right? We should also remember that, of course, the view that you had as a one-year-old child is very different to the view that you have today. You can all see that. But that means that things that you might today see as that was not very traumatic doesn't mean that you didn't experience it as something traumatic at that time. Now, once we've come up to a certain safety, we are feeling safe enough to begin to explore. So as soon as we start to learn how to walk, we begin to move and use our pelvis, we're coming into a more second chakra part. That's movement, and it's exploration, and it's developing our senses. It's very sensual. And of course, the glands that are linked to this part of the body is our gonads, which is our reproductive organs, and so sexual hormones, which means that it's everything that it's linked to sensuality, to pleasure, and creation, because of course, what is the sexual act or intercourse if not actually originally the creation of something? It's expansion, creation of a baby, for instance, and so. And so we begin to develop a sense of the world around us, and we begin to also like things or dislike things, right? That's when the baby also begins to explore with the mouth and everything. So that's when they touch everything and they put things in their mouths and such things, all right? And we begin to enjoy things and not. We begin to touch. Then once we've come up to the third chakra is something that develops more than let's say somewhere between the age of 3 and 5. Now, we're beginning to become a person. As long as a baby is kind of without a will, it's easy to handle because, well, basically they don't really have much to say. They just tag along. And so there's a reason that when we come up to the age of where we start to develop a little bit of a willpower, a bit of an identity, is what is commonly known in Anglo-Saxon worlds as the terrible twos. And it's the age of no. And actually in the country that I'm from, Sweden, we even call it the age of spite. It's basically when we learn to say yes and no, and we're very much enjoying the word no, because we also realize that there's a reaction to the no. And all of a sudden we begin to develop a power in that. But it's also, of course, when we're starting to become difficult to our parents. And all of a sudden, that little creature there, that I just, doing everything for him or her, starting to have a will of its own. And that's, unfortunately, where we begin to a little bit forget that they're people. They might be smaller in size, and they might have been less long on this planet, but they're still a person. But very easily we forget that because for generations that has not really been the case. Children weren't really seen as equals. Well, still today, I wouldn't really say that children are seen as equals. But so that's when we're starting to have a bit of a struggle situation. It's actually also, just as a very small thing to put in there, those of you who have heard of the Oedipus complex, Sigmund Freud developed a theory, which is very interesting. It's been contested later on, but I can feel that I see it quite strongly as well when you look at a child developing. It's the triangulation that happens when the child begins to make a difference between itself and the mother and the father. Mother figure, father figure, okay? And it's also then when we begin to develop understanding that mother and I are not the same thing. And then there's that third person maybe coming in. And I also start to realize that there's a difference between gender. That maybe as a girl, I'm the same gender as my mother. Or as a boy, that I'm the same gender as my father, obviously. And I also begin to, or the parents will actually teach me, that there's a difference of generation. This is a little bit the time, so the reason it's called Oedipus is because of the Greek myth of Oedipus, who ended up killing his father and marrying his mother. And then it went very bad when he realized, obviously, that he had done that. But never mind. It is what we can very often see as when the little girl wants to marry daddy, and the little boy loves his mother very, very much, right? And then the opposite sex parent comes in and kind of makes a break. This is when the child then understands the difference of generation. So basically, to make it as a simple one, the little girl wants to marry daddy. And then mommy comes in. She's the bad wolf all of a sudden, of course. But she comes in and she says, no, because daddy is my man. And you will find a man in your own generation one day. And so once that struggle is lost by the child, what they do then instead is that, okay, if I can't have daddy, then what I should do instead is to look what mum is, and I'm going to try to look like mummy. Basically, I'm beginning to get an idea of what a female is. And so then I'm starting to, this is really one of the biggest issues, I would say, with mother-daughter relationships. Very often mother-daughter relationships can be quite challenging, just like father-son relationships can be challenging. It's coming from this time. Because obviously, as a girl, we will begin to look at mother to understand what we are as a gender, right? So we start to develop an idea of what a woman is by looking at mother. And this is what boys do as well. So this is what we then start to see when girls become very feminine, for instance, and they start to, dress up in mommy's clothes or things like that. And the little boy who wants to play cowboys and Indians or whatever, just to take these very typical kind of gender roles. All right, so so this is the time that we're in as well when we talk about Manipura, when we talk about the third chakra. So this is a time when we develop our sense of I. All right. Um, Now, what is really difficult in this time is that because we are about 3-4 years old, we're completely dependent on our parents for survival. And we do not yet have the capacity to have a critical thinking, which means that we take everything very personally. And because we live in a world that is not our natural habitat, our parents, well, maybe life isn't always that easy. All right? So maybe mommy is depressed. Maybe mommy is really unhappy. Maybe something happened that mommy and daddy got separated and mommy's got a lot of stuff on her shoulders. Or maybe daddy has a lot of stuff on his shoulders. Maybe he has that pressure of being the provider. So he's never at home. So there's all these conditions, of course, external to us that we don't know about. All we see is mommy might not be happy. I cannot make mommy happy. Or daddy is not present. I cannot get his attention. Obviously, as you can hear, maybe I'm taking very typical, stereotypical examples here, but it's just because they're very, well, there's a reason they're stereotypical, because it's very, very common. All right? But the thing is, we end up doing everything that we can to get their love. So, I want to try to get mommy's attention, or to try to make mommy happy. I'm trying to get daddy's attention, because I love daddy, of course, right? And so we try to be something to correspond to what they need. And because they have so many other things that they're occupied with, their frustrations are very often misfired towards us. And so maybe in our behavior, in trying actually just to be seen and loved and all of that, they will misfire that towards not our doing so much, but who we are, right? You should be ashamed of yourself, for instance. Bad girl, bad boy. When we do things. And because we are not capable of seeing that, first of all, it has probably nothing to do with us, and second of all, they're talking about something that we're doing, but saying the words that is pointing straight into our being, all right? Saying to someone you should be ashamed of yourself when you are doing something that seems natural to you cuts you straight into your, well, empowerment, self-empowerment of the person that you are developing into, all right? Can you see what I'm saying? Yeah. And this is also how it then makes us into these people pleasers that we become later on in life. Let me take an example that I'm sure everyone can relate to. Whenever someone in our surrounding is not happy for some reason, or unhappy with us, or talking badly to us, as an adult, if we are clear in our heads, we can see that this has nothing to do with us, but we will still take it personally very easily, especially if it's a partner, if it's someone in our family, if it's a close friend, or work relations as well, because it's something that impacts our sense of well-being. And so if that impacts us, we feel bad. Imagine what this is like then when you're 3-4 years old and you don't have the capacity to understand that, well, technically it has nothing to do with me. And then also maybe we don't really have the ways to verbally express ourselves, to say that this is what I'm experiencing, because that we can do as adults. When you do this, when you act this way, it makes me feel this way, for instance. A 4-year-old is not really capable of doing that, so they will act out instead. And so this is where a very strong feeling state comes in that we all live with deeply down and that we call shame. And when we spoke about the second chakra last week, I was speaking about guilt. And guilt is something that can serve us, because guilt comes in as a finger, as a value point for when we're doing something that goes against our values. So guilt is linked to something that we do. And that can serve us, because when we do something that is against what our values are, and we feel that very strong feeling of guilt, it makes us remember that we don't want to do that again. However, shame taps deeper down, because it taps into who we are. So instead of saying that we're doing something wrong, we are wrong. Yeah. And if I'm wrong, then it means that I'm bad. And if I'm bad, it taps straight into our survival. Because if I'm bad, I will not be loved. And love for us is survival. Remember? We need our parents to survive. We need the groups to survive. Humans are flock people, flock animals. So we need the group to survive. So this whole, can you then just imagine just how strong the feeling is for us when our need to belong in society really comes, and our need to be this people-pleasing thing that we have, it comes down to a feeling of survival. Now, that's not what we consciously are thinking about, but this is where it comes from. This is where it stems from. So then imagine when it comes into the feeling to belong, the feeling to be accepted, to be good. If it stems from surviving, and then you look into today's world and this extreme need of being seen in social media and getting more likes and all of that, can you see in how this is then a need of being accepted, of feeling that you belong, of feeling that you are good enough? All of that stems from actually a need of survival. So when we look at this and we kind of actually shame them, the people who are very, very strong on this need on social media, we shame them in a certain way, because we say that, oh my God, look at them, their need of being seen and all of that, or they're on narcissist. I will actually make a point on narcissism as well. If you can then look at that instead and see that this is actually a need of survival that comes in, because somewhere there's a strong sense of lack, then we can be a little bit softer maybe in our hearts as well for this, right? Because actually, and that's when I'm going to come and just name this thing on narcissism. When we come into this feeling that we are not good enough, right? When shame has become something that is a part of our lives, we will then have this perception that what we are just authentically is not enough. And when we start to have this deep down belief, and this is not even on our thinking level, this is why it's so challenging to work on, that we are not good enough, what we do is that we begin to alter the way we are. We create a personality that we think will be accepted so that we will belong. This is when we start to manipulate. This is when we start to disengage, when we lie and we pretend. And all of that is actually coming from a belief that just being who we are is not enough. I personally find that the first time I heard someone saying manipulation is something that we do when we think that we cannot have what we want simply by being who we are, I thought it was like a very strong revelation to me. Because not only did it also create a certain softness for myself, when I'm in a situation, when I realize that I'm manipulating, we all manipulate constantly. Just the fact of, oh, I need to smile to this person so that they will give me something, for instance. It's actually manipulation in a certain way. Manipulation in itself is not a bad word, like we have it as a bad word, but it's not really. We manipulate, like the word originally means to modify, right? And when we can see that, oh, this is actually coming from some deep down belief that just being who we are isn't enough, then it creates a capacity of compassion towards ourselves and towards others. And this is why we'll do the inner child healing kind of work a little bit today. So, I wanted today say then a few words on narcissism because I feel like narcissism is a word that's thrown around a lot. And everyone's talking about narcissists since a few years, I feel. And we have all these ideas about narcissists. And we can even have this idea that narcissism is then a very strong sense of ego and a very strong third chakra. And it cannot be further from the truth. It's the opposite to that. It's very, very weak sense of I. Because what it is a need to try to compensate something. All right? So, let me explain it this way. Imagine, I'm going to take an example that's really silly. When there is a variable that's very important for you in order to feel okay, you will create a very strong need of this. And I was going to take I don't know why that came to my mind. I'm not married, but I'm thinking, imagine your wedding day, all right? You wake up on your wedding day, and there's just a couple of clouds. And so you become very concerned with whether it's going to be a beautiful day or if it's going to rain, right? And you can even go a little bit crazy according to maybe people around you because you're obsessed with knowing whether it's going to be a good sunshine day or if it's going to be raining, all right? It's a silly example, but I think that anyone have seen any of the typical American movies that we've seen about this, like comedies and stuff like that, you can project yourself into the situation. And then you would take the same day, but you have nothing special to do. You might even have a sick day, and you might even have decided you're going to stay in bed and watch a movie. You couldn't care less about those couple of clouds. It might even pour down rain for as much as you're concerned, because it doesn't really matter, all right? So that means that in the two situations, the weather will have or not an impact on your well-being. Someone who is completely at ease with themselves, who does not need the confirmation of someone else from the outside on knowing that they're good enough, couldn't really care less about what other people think. And so they don't really feel a strong need, for instance, to make themselves heard in a crowd, in a situation, because they already know who they are and what their worth is. Now, someone who does not know that, or maybe on the contrary, believes that they have no worth whatsoever, they will have a very strong need of the external confirmation for well-being. Does that make sense? So basically, it's actually a question of, like, we have a resistance with the situation. I have a resistance with the clouds because it's very important that it's sunny today for me to feel good. Or I couldn't care less because I'm good anyway. I'm going to be in bed. So the narcissist is basically like a starving child. Tell a starving child that it's bad to steal food, and they don't really care because all they're concerned with to feel good is that they need to put food in their belly. Tell a narcissist they don't need external confirmation. They're not going to hear that because that's what they need in order to feel that they have the right to exist. So what they do then is that they're going to try to compensate this. This is when we start to, for instance, try to bring someone else down. Yeah. We need to bring someone else down to actually feel that we're at least on their same level as them. Because actually, this whole idea of worth and of being good enough that is then planted a long time ago has as a byproduct that we begin to compare ourselves to others. Because how will we know if we're good enough? Well, we'll know if we're good enough if we're at least on the same level as the next person. Or ideally, are we a little bit more? And what will happen, unfortunately, is they're going to spend a lot of time thinking that we're not at their level. So we're going to try to, with this resistance, try to come up to the same level. And so this is when we start to do all of this. We manipulate, we start to treat people a certain way, as if what they are will define who we are. Like when I'm saying these words, you can also see it, how ridiculous it is. Why word the way someone else is define what I am? Yet that is what we're doing constantly. And this is where vulnerability comes in. Because shame brings in the notion of vulnerability. We do not want to be vulnerable. Now, this is very natural to us. It's natural. Look around you in nature. Animals in nature has ways of creating an armor, for instance, to keep themselves, to not be vulnerable. All right? So that's natural to us. We don't want to be vulnerable because there's a risk for survival. Okay? Can everyone hear me now, even if there's that noise out there? Okay. Yeah? Aaron, you can hear me? Perfect. All right. But unfortunately, when it comes into the person that we are and the feeling of shame, the vulnerability is not so much of an actual physical need of survival, but it comes into our personality. And that's when it becomes very difficult to deal with. Because when it comes into our personality, it is much harder to detect because it's in the thought. Yeah, this is very unfortunate. Sorry about that. I hope that it's not going to last long. When we spoke about on the first chakra that the demon that comes in on the first chakra is fear, for instance, and that will translate in the body on fight, flight, or freeze mode. Right? The nervous system switches on. I'm ready to fight or to run away from a situation. I can feel, when I develop a certain awareness about myself, I can start to notice, all right, I'm switching on the fear mode because I can feel physically that I'm freezing, for instance, and I'm starting to wonder how I can get out of this situation. When it comes to the second chakra as well, and how the feeling of guilt comes in as a demon and blocks us, we can also more quickly notice this because we feel blocked in what we do, and the sensation of guilt comes in our actions, and we can more easily detect it because it's an action in a certain way. When it comes into shame, what's really hard is that it becomes the words in our mind. And so it's much more difficult to detect and to work on because when we come into a shame-bound state, what we hear deep down is you are not good enough. And it doesn't matter how much you succeed in this and that, your father still didn't pay attention to you. Or can you see where I'm going with this? So it's so hard to access. And this is also why it's so hard to work on, because very quickly that the counter thoughts will come in. So I'm working on shame, I'm working on being vulnerable, I'm taking action, and all of a sudden my mind gets the better of me and I manage to talk myself out of trying to be vulnerable with the thoughts that anyway I'm not good enough. So being able to catch oneself in the thought can be really hard. Shame-bound people are people who value thoughts more than feelings. Very typical example of this is, I think it's in America, they say keeping it up with the Joneses or something like that. It's basically trying to be like everyone else a little bit. And so we're shame-bound when it's very important what other people think of us. And what we do then, of course, is that we love to look at people who are less shame-bound and who do whatever they want and then put blame on them. Oh, look at them. And the shame comes in. And what happens there really is that we feel shame for them. You should be ashamed of yourself. It's basically, I feel shame for you. What's behind that? What's behind that is that someone who is not that shame-bound allow themselves to do what feels good. And I will feel resistance to that because I don't allow myself to do it. But because shame is so strong and I don't want to feel vulnerable, I refuse to feel that, okay, this person is doing something that I don't allow myself to do. And so I project it onto them instead. And I blame them. I don't want to take responsibility for my own vulnerability. And so I blame other people. Does this make sense to everyone? Yeah. I'm actually going to take an example that happened to me just the other day. And it was funny because it's as I was sitting doing some work, preparing for this workshop, of a really, for me, then obvious situation of shame, blame, and not wanting to be vulnerable. So there's a reason that we very much link then addictions to the third chakra. Because of course, when we're in this very strong negative emotion, we want to do anything to get out of that emotional state, okay? As I mentioned the very first day as well, if there's one thing we all have in common, is that we don't want to feel pain, okay? So I will do anything to not feel that. Very easily then I take on things, behaviors, or substances to numb that feeling of shame. So addictions is very much linked to this. I have a friend who has an addiction into alcohol. And she lives in another country, and she was messaging me, and she was being very upset in a situation where she's addicted to alcohol, but also to drugs, because of her alcohol issues. She went to see a doctor who was a psychiatrist, who then gave her medicine, and then she got addicted to the medication instead, because obviously the root of it all is not being treated. So it's changing one thing for another substance, right? Okay, anyway. And it went so far that the father of her daughter, who's a little girl, then a small child, had taken the daughter away from her and refused to give her when she was supposed, because they've got like a, what do you call that again? They're separated, so they shared custody, yes. And there was social workers involved in the whole thing and whatever. And so she, obviously, in her situation, were thinking that we're exaggerating and there was something wrong with the father and the social workers, and they were all conspiring against her, right? And so she ended going to court. And the judge ruled in favor of the father. And because she refused to see her part of this, so taking responsibility, which means actually allowing oneself to show the vulnerable part of oneself, she managed to turn this into saying, the judge ruled in favor of him, even though, and so she started blaming the judge, even though she's a woman, and this judge comes from a part of that country that's very rural, let's say, and that has a high level of alcoholism. And so even though she's a woman and she comes from there, she could not see that I was a suitable parent. And I was listening to her, so you can hear as well how this sounds like really strange arguments, really strange way of reasoning. This is how far we can go to not feel vulnerable, because feeling vulnerable in this situation would mean, yes, I'm wrong here. I'm not dealing with my daughter the right way. I have not taken control over my addictions to treat it. And I managed to go, but this is an intelligent girl. She's got a master's in I don't know what, in economy, and I'm not talking about someone who's ignorant in general. I'm talking about someone who's got a clear view on, but when it comes to ourselves, all of a sudden we are 5-year-olds again, because that's really what it is. So when we have these situations a lot, now this was a strong example to kind of show, and because it happened the other day, and I was sitting here writing my text about it, I'm like, oh my God. But just take any situation where vulnerability and shame is triggered for you in relation to other people. How quickly we tend to react in childish ways. Frown, become angry, stamp with your foot, I'm not getting what I want kind of thing. Actually, we go straight back into that 4-year-old, 5-year-old in that mode, because actually this is when the wound also happened first, right? And we never really healed it. We actually created our personality around it instead. And so it's going to send back straight away back to that original wounding. All right. We can see this very easily when we feel that we have come very far with ourselves. We've developed ourselves, we do our yoga practice, we meditate, we study some kind of spirituality maybe, and then boom, we go for a week back to see the family. Right? I think it was, do you know Eckhart Tolle? Yeah, I think he was the one actually said, if you think you're enlightened, try spending a week with your family. Because actually it goes so quickly back into those roles. And how come, even as we become these adults who are very free and responsible in our actions and we do the things, yet we feel a need to have our parents' blessing, even later on in life. I know so many people, grown-ups, they've got their own stuff together, and when they want to, buy a house, for instance, they still kind of need their parents to get their opinion, and say like, oh yeah, this is, I agree with this, you have my blessing. Even just the idea of, I know that's a traditional thing since a long time, the whole thing about getting a blessing for getting married and stuff, but we still want our parents and the family and stuff to kind of say that, yeah, we agree that the person you want to marry is a good person and things like that. So it's very natural to us. It's not that it's not understandable that it's like this, but we can see this 5-year-old in the need to be good enough and, and the whole vulnerable part of ourselves and the need to acknowledgement in there. Let's see. One thing, and that's also one of the reasons that we'll do this inner child healing. One of the best ways to deal with shame is, and I'm not going to put the hashtag in front of it, but it's the idea of me too. Because what really is in the vulnerable side of the shame is that we feel that we're alone with what we're going through. So if I'm wrong, it means that someone else is right, for instance. But if someone stands next to me and says, no, me too, then all of a sudden we're a little bit empowered and we feel a little bit better about ourselves. And if there's someone else who's experienced the same thing that we've been through or the feeling that we have, we feel a little bit less strange or a little bit less different to everyone else. So just the fact of having someone that says you're not alone, for instance, has a really good effect on the feeling of shame. And I think that is also one of the reasons that the whole Me Too movement actually came in, because a lot of women were living in shame with things that they had experienced. And so the Me Too kind of came in as a, I'm here with you. And as you do the inner child healing, what you do is that you kind of go back, and today we're not going to focus, well, each and one of you will do what feels best for them, obviously, but you don't have to focus on a specific memory. But the idea is to go back in time almost and to alter a memory by being the parent that wasn't maybe there in that moment, being the one that goes and does what we needed in that moment, for instance. So it's kind of that me too, I'm here for you kind of feeling. So that's what we'll work on today. And yeah. Oh, I really would have loved for that to stop before we come into our meditation.
So we're going to be working on a memory that hurt us in the past.
No, as I said, you can obviously do that if you want, but that's not specifically what we'll focus on today, because it's also something that we might rather do in a situation that's more private. But it very often the idea of inner child healing is used quite a lot in therapy. And what the idea is originally is to come back to the memory of a situation where someone wasn't maybe there for us the way we needed them to. And then recreate that situation and then be that parent for the child. Or which Tara Brach, that I have mentioned before, calls it actually spiritual reparenting even, and I think that's quite nice. And so actually to go back to find the emotional state and then alter it. Because remember what I said when we just started there an hour ago? We have this capacity to visualize, which can be really beneficial for us. It's detrimental to us when we use it as a way to keep putting ourselves back in an emotional state by being stressed about something, future or past. So we keep putting ourselves in that feeling state. But we can also then use it to its opposite, which means that what really hurts you in the now is the feeling state that you remember that is triggered when you come into a situation where you feel vulnerable, all right, or where shame comes in. So if you're in your mind can go back to that and then alter the situation, which means that you will see it differently. You will create a different emotional state to it. This is how you heal yourself in the present. The idea of time is actually completely psychological. So everything that you've been through in life is still inside of you. Every experience is still there, whether you remember it or not. So it's just that we're triggering. Have you ever heard of neuropeptides? Anyway, okay. So it's these things that we have in our brain that we get extremely addicted to. And it's the triggering of emotional states. So the neuropeptides trigger, there's each emotional state has its own neuropeptides. And so they're firing off in the brain when we are putting ourselves in a context, in a situation that triggers this emotional state. And so then each time that we put ourselves in a situation that will again trigger this emotional state in our brain, the chemical reaction that actually is, we will trigger it again. All right? This means that if we keep putting ourselves constantly in the same situation, we keep triggering this emotional state, and we very, very quickly access this emotional state. That works on the positive and on the negative as well then, of course. So that means that we're very good at doing it for the negative emotional states. But if we can then revert that to make this into a positive feeling state instead, and then keep triggering the positive feeling state, then that will be more beneficial for us, all right? That's why being in a loving relationship with people is very beneficial for us, because we will then trigger the feeling of love more often than when we're feeling maybe isolated and on our own. But we have to remember that it's all happening inside of us. We're very concerned with the external signals, with what happens around us, because those are the triggers. But what we're doing is happening inside of us. And the advantage that we have when we understand that is that we have the control of what is happening. Something happens outside of me that could trigger a negative emotional state. But if I'm well aware of what's happening, I can then come back into my meditative state, if you will, and go, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to trigger that emotional state. I'm not going to go into those thoughts again. I obviously have had to develop a quite good sense of awareness to my thoughts in order to do that. And that happens through a regular practice. So having a regular physical practice where you're conscious in what you're doing, for instance, a yogic practice, having a regular meditative practice where you begin to still your mind, to observe your thoughts, and you do it regularly so that you register this, so that it becomes easy for you to access this. That's how we start to develop those moments where, okay, there's an external situation that could trigger a negative state of mind inside of me, but I'm seeing already, I'm aware of what's happening, and I'm choosing to not go there. This is that space that you might have heard of when they talk about that you come into a space where you can choose the reaction or choose actually the action instead of just reacting to something. All right, so what we are going to do is that putting ourselves in that state of the inner child healing is not easy. Because of our thinking mind, we have so much resistance to this. Me, myself, when I've tried it the first few times, it was completely impossible to access. I felt ridiculed, I felt all kinds of stuff, and I couldn't put myself there. I couldn't see myself as a child and then the parent coming in. So what happens is that we need to put ourselves in a very, very open and receiving state. If you have already practiced yoga and then you lay down in what is called shavasana, so the resting part at the end, you have experienced something similar maybe to that. Have you felt that when you lay down at the end of a yoga class, there's a certain, vulnerable state that you're in? Some people even cry sometimes when they lay down in shavasana because we open up very much. We're very open in that state. We've released a lot of tensions in the body, and therefore in the mind and in the heart. So we created space and we lay down and we kind of let everything just sink in. This is why we also sometimes enjoy to have some very soft, emotional music on as well. That kind of triggers that openness. Tears is our best way of emotional release, for instance. So we put ourselves in a very open state when we do that. And so it's very good to put yourself in that kind of very open state before you begin the work, because you allow yourself, there's a little bit less of all those armors that comes in, protecting. And breathing exercises are a very good way to kind of begin letting go of that defense that we put up. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and I'm hoping that maybe they can stop that during that, but probably they won't. And then so that you can go to the bathroom or whatever you might need to do. And then we're going to start with some breathing exercises, and then we'll go into the visualizations with meditation, and the last part of it is going into the inner child healing. All right? Does that sound good to everyone? Do I have any questions maybe? All right, let's take 5. If anyone needs the bathroom, just by the other side of the pool, there's 2 bathrooms.